Do you feel like your addictions are holding you down? Do you feel like you'll never be free? Then I have the perfect video for you today, because today we're going to go through some basic information about addictions to help you understand them better, and then I'm going to give you a 6-stage process to help you finally break free from your addictions. So if that video excites you and that's something you've wanted to do for a long time, then keep watching, because this is the episode for you. So there's different types of addictions and there's so many examples we can give. I'm just going to list a few. This is by no means an exhaustive list. So it could be physically based, so smoking, alcohol, binge eating. It could be social media consumption. It could be watching adult content. It could be gambling. It could be binge spending. It could really be anything. Okay, addictions have existed since the dawn of time, and they're going to keep being there as long as we're human beings as well. So there's no shortage of addictions, but the point is, this video can help you overcome. You can use the principles to overcome any type of addiction. It's not specific to any one type of addiction, okay? So the first 2 things that we're going to talk about to help you understand your addiction a bit better are the difference between an addiction and a habit. So both of these are repetitive actions that you'll engage in. However, for something to become an addiction, it usually has to have a psychological component to it as well, and it has to have a negative impact on your life, which you may or may not be aware of, okay? The next thing I'm going to talk about is conscious and unconscious incompetence, and it's a model that's used when you're talking about skills and habits, and we're going to talk about it in breaking addictions, but I'm going to explain it with an example of driving. So there's 4 stages to this model. So there's unconsciously incompetent, consciously incompetent, consciously competent, and unconsciously competent. So if we go through it quickly, those are some big words, but I'll quickly explain it. So if you were to take the example of somebody who's learning to drive, so if you think about a child who has no idea how to drive a car, they don't really know what they're doing, they're just maybe 3-4 years old, okay? They are unconsciously incompetent. They have no idea what driving is really. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, and they had no idea how to do it, even if they did know what it is, okay? Then the next thing to talk about is being consciously incompetent. So perhaps the night before somebody's driving lesson, or when they first start, okay, they're going to realise that they're not really as good as driving as they see other people, and they're going to see, oh, actually, I'm not very good at this, it's really hard, okay? And they're going to realise, they're going to be consciously aware of the fact that they are incompetent at the skill, i.e. they can't do it, okay? And the next stage is becoming consciously competent. So this could be somebody who's doing their driving test, or maybe a few years afterwards, like a new driver, and they're very conscious and aware, hyper-focusing on everything they do. So they're really paying attention to their gears, looking in the mirrors, everything like that. I'm just going to quickly pick up my cheat sheet piece of paper, and basically they are doing everything correctly, but they have to consciously do it, and it requires a lot of effort and focus. And the next stage after that is being unconsciously competent. So this is somebody who's been driving for a long time, okay, and they know exactly what to do. It's very habitual. They just check the mirrors, they check the mirrors in a regular way. They don't have to make a conscious effort to do it, they just subconsciously do it, okay, and they can probably, you'll see them engaging in another habit while they're driving. So perhaps eating, perhaps talking, something that a learner driver or a new driver couldn't really do, okay? So that's the process of the conscious and unconscious incompetence, okay? And we're going to apply this to the stages of addiction, okay? So it's not going to surprise you that if I talk about 6 tips to help you finally break free of your addiction, the first step is going to be to acknowledge that you have a problem, okay? And this is going to move you from that first stage of being subconsciously incompetent or unconsciously incompetent to becoming consciously incompetent, because you're going to finally acknowledge that you have a problem. So you might not necessarily think that you have an addiction, or you might not necessarily think this is having negative consequence on your life, okay? So the first thing to do, I think most people will realize they have an addiction, which is why they're watching the video, okay, and it's really good that you're doing that. But in case you don't think you have an addiction, I would just encourage you to take a look at your time, your habits, and also your money, and also your relationships, okay? Because if you have an addiction, it's probably going to be affecting one of those 4 things in a number of ways. It's probably going to be affecting all 4 of them, but it will definitely be affecting one of them at least, okay? And the other thing to realize with addictions is that you have to acknowledge when something is an addiction for you. I'll give you an example. So some people, I mentioned earlier that alcohol could be an addiction. So some people can drink alcohol in a social context, and it's more of a habit. It doesn't have any psychological context or need or benefit for them, okay? However, somebody who's going to the gym because they're insecure and they're trying to make up for other things, or they're avoiding social contact because they're going to the gym, that could actually be an addiction for them, okay? So you have to realize, I'm not saying going to the gym is bad, but I'm saying addictions can be different for different people, okay? So for somebody, something that you might consider a bad habit, actually they have no psychological attachment to it, and it's not really harming their life in any tangible way besides this one-off thing. Okay, so it might not actually be an addiction for them, however something that might seem a bit more beneficial for you. Okay, so spending time on your computer, spending time on social media, this could be a huge addiction for you. Okay, and you have to realize that. So that's the first step, is to acknowledge that you have an addiction. And the second step is to then start to address the physical factors of this addiction. So you have to look at, where are you taking place in this habit? Okay, what times are you weakest? Okay, so just the physical information. Okay, when does this affect you? How many times are you doing it? And then you also have to say, so I touched on it a bit earlier about alcohol and the social setting. So you have to see, is this a social addiction or is this a private addiction? Okay, so is this something you do alone, and is this something you do when you're around other people? Because this is a really key part of addressing the addiction. Okay, so a lot of people, they might drink socially, they might behave differently in different social situations, and that's a really key part. So if you can identify that, that's going to help you later on when we talk about how to what to do about that. But a really key thing you could do, if you know it's around certain people, you can cut them off, you can have a discussion about that. If it's something you do by yourself, okay, initially you might find it beneficial to spend more time around other people, you might find it more beneficial to spend less time alone. However, in the long term, you cannot live your life around somebody else constantly 24/7. There are going to be times when you're alone, and there are going to be times where you may relapse. So that's why I've covered more points more comprehensively in the next 4 steps. Okay, so we've gone through step 1, which is acknowledge you have a problem, and then step 2 is to start working on identifying the physical factors of that. Okay, and now step 3 is to start understanding the psychological relationship that you have with this addiction. Okay, so why do you engage with this addiction in the first place? Okay, and there's numerous reasons why people do it. Okay, so stress relief could be one, avoiding social contact, avoiding difficult situations. It could be procrastination. Okay, I've given a few of these. It could be low self-esteem in cases of binge eating disorder, or anything really. Okay, so I'm not giving you an exhaustive list of what's causing your addiction, but I'm saying you definitely need to have a sit down and think, why are you engaging in this behavior? And the other thing you have to do is you have to ask yourself, why do you actually want to break free from this bad habit? Why do you want to break free from this addiction? Okay, because that's going to be a really powerful motivator in helping you to overcome that addiction. Okay, and then I'm just going to see if there's anything else I missed. Okay, and you have to specifically ask, okay, what role is this addiction providing you? Is it comfort? Is it escapism? Is it pleasure? Is it, something else? Okay, so you have to ask yourself, what role is it providing for you? And you also have to ask what you're avoiding, okay, in the case of procrastination. So is it because you're struggling at school? Is it because you're struggling at work? Is it because you're struggling at home? Is it because you want to avoid social contact? So that's why I'm saying you have to ask yourself, what are you avoiding? Okay, so that's the third step, is to understand the psychological factors behind it. Okay, and then the 4th step, okay, this is quite hard for you to understand, but you're going to have to accept that this is going to be a really long process, and a lot of the things I've said in this video, they're very clear and simple steps, but they're not easy, and they may take years or months or weeks to identify. But hopefully by watching this video, you'll be able to fast track through these steps and be able to get to the end faster. So that's why you have to understand that it's a long process, and relapses can happen, and you have to understand as well a few other things. So when you go through a relapse, so let's say you're trying to save money and your addiction is gambling, what might happen is you might get to a point where you've been free from gambling for a while, and you've been saving your money, and you've actually now, like I said earlier, you wanted a reason to keep breaking this addiction now. So your reason, let's say you're saving up for something, so you saved up this money and you have a little relapse, so you end up spending, let's say you saved up 50,000, I'm just making random numbers up, they're round numbers and they're easy to understand. Okay, and let's say one night you end up spending 5,000. Okay, you have to catch yourself very, very quickly before your negative self-depreciation takes over. It's very common at the point of a relapse where somebody will then have a huge binge relapse. Okay, so in the case of gambling, this would look like they would then say, oh, I've lost 5,000 already, let me just spend all 50,000 right now, I'm never good enough, I'll never keep saving. Let's say the goal was to save to 100,000, let's say that. Okay, you have to stop that self-depreciation negative talk right there. You have to understand the relapse happened, it's part of the process, and you have to stop it there. You have to do your absolute best, and I know it's really hard when you're dealing with your own feelings and when you're dealing with behaviours that have been going on for a very long time. But you have to do your absolute best to stop that from happening and pushing yourself down a path of further deterioration. So that's one thing to remember, okay? And the other thing to remember is you have to create some distance from your identity from the addiction, okay? So you have to stop. A lot of people who, for example, people who smoke, they're labelled as smokers, okay? And that doesn't help as their identity, okay? It makes sense, they smoke, they're a smoker, okay? But when you're trying to break that, if people have always seen you as a smoker, that can be a very difficult thing to break. So you're going to have to find a way to redefine your identity, whether that's by creating a new habit or creating distance from this old habit, okay? And the other thing about creating distance from this bad habit is it's really important to track progress. But like I was saying, as you move through the stages of competence, somebody who is consciously incompetent or consciously competent in those middle two stages, they may be tracking the days or the times, how long they've been free from this habit, okay? So how many days I've gone without a cigarette, how many days I've gone without alcohol, etc., okay? And that's a really good way of measuring progress. However, it shifts your mindset into thinking you have to spend every single second consciously avoiding that thing. And like I said, you're now basing your identity around it, and it's going to be much harder for you to escape from that addiction. So during the first 2 to 3 stages, it's understandable why people would keep progress in this way. But as we're trying to move to the last stage, the unconsciously competent stage, where you're so good at the skill, you've broken the addiction, and you don't even need to think about it anymore other than a passing thought, okay? Then to get to that stage, you need to get to a point where you actually stop counting the days and you stop associating your identity with this habit, okay? And the other thing to remember, it's really important to remember actually, is a lot of these addictions may cause physical symptoms. So every addiction will affect you at a biochemical level, whether that's in your brain or your blood in some way. However, you have to remember specific addictions such as smoking or alcohol or taking drugs, they will affect your body physically. And it's really important to tell you that right now, because it's important that you do your best to break the habit. It's important you do your best to break it by yourself. But these breaking your habit or withdrawing from the substance will cause physical withdrawal symptoms. And it's really important that you get seen by a medical professional to avoid any in medical emergencies if that occurs, okay? So that's a really important thing to remember. And the other thing to remember, like I was saying, is when you're talking about relapses, is really important to remember that the physical substance, when you relapse into it, it might initially provide, if you've been going away for a long time and then you take it, like for example alcohol or drugs, it might provide a much more intense stimulation than when you were taking it every day. And it's really important to remember that when you're trying to break the habit, because it's going to set you back a few days, obviously, if you do, and it might reset some of your progress. So that's another thing you have to remember. Okay, so step number 4 was understanding that it's a long process and you may relapse. Okay, step number 5, okay, this is a mindset shift, okay? So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to, from here, you're going to have to shift your mindset, like I said. So this is really pivoting off the point that I mentioned where you're trying to shift your identity away from it, okay? And you're going to have to do a lot of thinking, and like I said, it's really easy for me to say these points, but it's probably going to take much longer to implement. But like I said, with this video, you'll be on a fast track to doing that. So eventually, when you break it down, you have to see, like I said, what role is this providing in your life? And usually what you'll find is almost any addiction, and that's why I made this video to apply to a lot of addictions universally rather than one specifically, is a lot of addictions can be boiled down to a very similar mindset, okay? So usually the addiction will provide a temporary relief, okay, a relief from stress, and a source of comfort, okay? That's the psychological perceived benefits in the short term, okay? However, in the long term, it will only lead to dependence, and it will only lead to more problems. And one of the biggest problems when people are trying to break free from addiction is that, like I said, their identity is associated with it. But a bigger psychological issue is it's very hard for people to try something unknown. The fear of the unknown is a very common fear in human society and the human condition. So you have to understand that when you're trying to break free from an addiction, what you're essentially doing is you're trying to break free from this comfort, this negative and painful comfort, but you perceive it as a comfort, but it's a known pain. You know what this pain is like, and you know what kind of problems it's giving you in your life, and you're not happy about it and you're trying to break it, but the point is you know. Whereas you feel like you don't quite know what will happen if you break free from this addiction. You don't know what's going to happen, okay? So that's an unknown, that's an anxiety. And so essentially what you're doing when you're breaking free from an addiction is you're trading you're trading a known comfort for an unknown anxiety, and that can become very difficult for people to comprehend. Okay, and not only that, but once you comprehend it, you actually understand why it's so difficult for people to break free from their addictions, because of this really strong association with the perceived comfort. So you have to realize that it will only get worse if you keep sticking to that comfort, and you know exactly what's going to happen if you keep going through with it. That's why you stick with it, but eventually it's going to lead to negative self-esteem. You're always going to feel like a quitter, and like I said at the beginning of the video, you're going to feel like you can never be free. So it might seem like, oh, this is a comfort, I know about this, and this is unknown, but you know exactly that this is causing so many problems, and actually, one thing, it might be an anxiety and an unknown of breaking free from the addiction, but one thing you definitely know is it will be better than staying addicted for the rest of your life, okay? So that's one important thing to bear in mind, okay? And then the last thing to bear in mind, the final thing, is just some practical steps you can take. So you have to go easy on yourself, okay? And like Socrates said, one of the best things to do is focus on building the new rather than replacing the old. So this is a really good way of, like I said, a practical thing to do is focus on replacing your bad habit with new habits, or like I said, if your social group is the problem, replace your old social group with a new social group. And like I said, it's really easy for me to say these things. They do take a long time to implement, but hopefully this gives you a focus on what you can actually go and do. So don't be too hard and don't be too focused on destroying the old, focus on building the new. And like I said, that's also going to help shift and pivot your mindset and your identity away from the addiction. The next thing to focus on is actually just a few things. So finding a meaning in life. So I mentioned before that finding a meaning, finding a higher purpose is a really good thing for you to do. It is definitely a good way of overcoming an addiction, and like I said, it also helps you have a good reason why you can overcome that addiction. So like Friedrich Nietzsche said, he who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. And like Viktor Frankl said, when you lose your meaning or purpose in life, that's when you're reduced to simple pleasure. So if you have a meaning and a higher purpose, it's going to help you avoid some of these addictions, okay? The last thing to remember is never give up. It's going to be a very difficult journey, and there's lots of people who are struggling with various addictions. You can find lots of support groups online. And the last thing to tell you is to inform your friends and family and those around you, and to seek medical attention if you keep struggling with the same addiction. And also, like I said, with those physical addictions, to remember to keep trying to seek medical attention to avoid any to treat some of the physical symptoms of the addiction in case they become a medical emergency. So I'm just going to quickly go over what we did today. So we talked about the different steps behind an addiction, so how it's different from a habit, and then the model of conscious and unconscious incompetence, and how actually when you start an addiction you might not even be aware that you have it, okay? So you're unconsciously incompetent, but by the end of this 6-stage process, you want to be subconsciously competent, where you're at the point where you don't even think about the addiction anymore because you're so busy doing other things in your life and creating a meaning and finding a better purpose in life. And the 6 stages you can do is, firstly, to acknowledge that you have an addiction. Secondly, to treat the physical side of it and start collecting physical information about where this addiction is, when you're doing it, etc. And then the last thing you can do, the third thing you can do, is address the psychological factors, okay? Then the fourth thing you have to do is you understand it's a long process and you might relapse. The fifth thing you have to do is shift your mindset. And the sixth thing you have to do is never give up. And like I said, inform the relevant people, your family, your friends and medical professionals. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I really enjoyed making it. It was a lot of research and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Take care, guys. Peace out. Follow for more amazing content. Master your feelings and master yourself.